Treaty: a written agreement between two or more sovereign nations or states. Of: used as a function word to indicate origin or derivation. Universal: that which exists in and of the material universe. Community: a group of sentient beings living together in common unity. Trust: the faithful reliance upon that which we do not control. Proclamation of independence, sovereignty, and jurisdiction. Let it be known by all concerned, affected, and interested parties that the independence and sovereignty of the communities of indigenous free peoples who ratify this treaty is hereby proclaimed, declared, and affirmed without equivocation, and is vested solely in the men and women of those communities, both individually and collectively, notwithstanding the fact that their representatives may be authorized by each to act in a sovereign capacity on their collective behalf in strictly limited sets of circumstances, such as those mankind currently finds itself in, for the purposes of achieving the inter-community consensus required to establish a supreme jurisdiction under the guiding principles of natural law, supplemented and interpreted in this Treaty of Universal Community Trust, with a view to bringing about the following aims and objectives. 1. An end to all crimes against mankind and the earth that are currently being perpetrated by governments, whether elected or not, corporations, organizations, individuals, and legal entities of all natures and descriptions. 2. The dismantling of all industries which, by developing, manufacturing, and exploiting for profit any substance, product, or byproduct, cause actual damage, harm, injury, or loss to mankind and/or damage to the earth. 3. The deconstruction of unsustainable fiscal systems that would facilitate one man to have and one man to have not, including, without limitation, the abolition of usury in all its forms and the demonopolization of land rights, international borders, mediums of exchange, trading platforms, and the means of communicating, publishing, and distributing information. 4. The nullifying, settlement, and/or discharge of all outstanding or allegedly owed debts, obligations, and liabilities, with a view to replacing unaccountable, unsustainable, and inequitable usury-based financial systems with localized and autonomous permanent credit facilities or depositories in every community that stands under the jurisdiction of Universal Community Trust. 5. The eradication of all forms of artificial scarcity and its effects, including homelessness, famine, and disease, by and through the facilitation of a naturally abundant, peaceful, free, and harmonious environment for mankind to dwell, and the distribution of organic materials, agricultural produce, seeds, and proven natural health remedies. 6. The dissolution of mankind's dependence upon fossil fuel industries for the production of energy, including, without limitation, coal seam gas mining, coal-fired power stations, and oil drilling, as well as the cessation of all toxic pollution of the biosphere of the Earth in any detrimental form whatsoever, whether it be gaseous, liquid, solid, or radioactive, and the closure and cleanup of all unsafe nuclear power facilities. 7. The rapid development, manufacture, distribution, and implementation of new and existing free and clean energy technologies in every community upon the Earth under Universal Community Trust. 8. A ceasefire in all wars, the repatriation of all armed services personnel, following the repudiation of all unlawful allegiances, and the setting aside of all oaths made in the service of private interests to the detriment of mankind, and the unequivocal commitment of the parties to this treaty to recall and withdraw any and all beneficiaries of Universal Community Trust from every armed conflict at the earliest opportunity. 9. The establishment of cooperative trade networks in and between all communities with a view to promoting the localization of trade, self-sufficiency, mutual cooperation, and the eventual replacement of money with unconditional pledges of sweat equity, which shall form the basis for the permanent credit of every beneficiary of Universal Community Trust. 10. An agreement that privately issued promissory notes made payable to bearer on demand by any grantor, trustee, or beneficiary of Universal Community Trust may be used for the purposes of settling any valid financial obligation or to create credits in their account held at the community's depository, the balance of which will be transferable to any account in another jurisdiction, provided those credits are not used for any purpose that is detrimental to mankind and/or the earth. 11. The nullifying of any and all judicial proceedings and convictions for victimless crimes, as well as the positive law which legalized such unlawful proceedings, and the prohibition and prevention of any man being charged with future crimes. 12. The facilitation of the re-emergence of the universal bond of common unity between the free indigenous peoples of the earth in order to achieve these aims and objectives in the most peaceful, amicable, and equitable manners. Repudiation of presumed jurisdictions and authorities. Having agreed that the presumption of the authority to act upon the people or any nation or community must necessarily be derived from their consent to be regulated by the rules governing any lawfully established jurisdiction, it is observable that almost every community of people on the earth currently lives under a system which does not meet their needs, the controllers of which are able to use coercion and manipulation under threat of force, violence, and/or incarceration in order to gain acquiescence to their positive laws, to which most of the people who populate the earth have not given their free and unambiguous consent, as is the well-established principle of lawful governance. In other words, the current system is a globally imposed hegemony of private vested interests, the service of which has been detrimental to the beautiful and naturally bountiful earth, as well as systematically deconstructing the universal bond of common unity between its peoples, without which freedom, peace, abundance, and mutually beneficial cooperation between nations cannot exist. It is therefore declared without division that the indigenous nations standing under universal community trust have denied or revoked their citizenship and their consent to be governed under the laws of any other jurisdiction, whilst every jurisdictional claim by any purported ruling authority is repudiated by the execution of this treaty, for and on behalf of every member of every nation party to it. Henceforth, all disputes and/or complaints lodged by or against any grantor, trustee, or beneficiary of Universal Community Trust will be settled or heard in arbitration proceedings or before a jury of 13 of their peers, unless otherwise unambiguously agreed between the parties concerned and subject to the provisions of this treaty regarding the formation of supreme grand juries and any duly ratified amendments. Amendments to this treaty. Amendments may be proposed by the formal written proposal of any trustee of a sovereign community trust for and on behalf of any of its beneficiaries, which shall be presented for consideration at a convention of the founding trustees of Universal Community Trust. Every proposal for an amendment that has the unanimous support of the nations who ratify this treaty will be brought into force and effect by its inclusion in this instrument, as if the amendment was set forth in the original treaty, provided that it is duly ratified under the seal of Universal Community Trust, whether at a convention or otherwise. In acknowledgement of the ancient usages, rights, and customs of the free indigenous peoples of the earth, the parties to this treaty agree as follows. There are three foundations of every community: common unity, peaceful possession, and equity for all. There are three foundations of equity: protection, correction, and natural justice. There are three protections and securities for every member of the community: of life and the body, of the place we make a home, and of our natural rights. There are three things which promote common unity: empathy, respect, and unconditional love for our fellow man. There are three things which strengthen common unity: effective protection and security for every man and his property, just correction wherever it is required, and forgiveness derived from an equitable cause. There are three things that destroy common unity: cruel and unjust punishments, forgiveness derived from blind respect and partiality, and false judgment, where no man can obtain natural protection. There are three pillars of every community: sovereignty of the individual and the nation, the voice of the people, and equitable resolutions of disputes and complaints. There are three things which ought to belong to each of these three pillars: equity to all, protection and defense to all, and open source information for the instruction, knowledge, and records of all. There are three elements of equitable resolutions: right knowledge, natural right, and conscientious rectitude. There are three energies of equitable resolutions: a learned arbitrator or jury, a faithful witness, and a conscientious verdict. There are three mandatory qualifications of every jury or arbitrator of a dispute or complaint: a full and complete knowledge of the facts of the matter, the customs of the community, and the tendencies and consequences of the times. There are three things which every arbitrator should constantly study: natural truth, conscientious forgiveness, and the energetic diktats of knowledge. There are three indispensabilities of every community: the sovereignty of the self-governed, the voice of the people being heard without prejudice, and the consistent and unbiased administration of equity. There are 3 universally binding actions that should require the verdict of a supreme grand jury of 13 sovereign representatives to effect in any nation: the deposition of a de facto government or acting sovereign paramount, the banishment of criminal religious institutions and monarchies, and the equitable reclamation of the lands, resources, and properties unlawfully held by such parties, and the suspension or repudiation of laws and instruments that do not benefit mankind and/or cause damage to the earth. There are 3 unalienable birthrights: the right to peaceful possession of a parcel of land, fit for the purposes of building a home, growing food, and raising a family, with unrestricted access to clean, unpolluted water, as well as the minerals below and airspace above it; the right to use all necessary and reasonable defenses to protect the body, family, and property from theft, fraud, damage, harm, and loss; and the right to self-determination under natural law. There are 3 guarantees of every community which has the voluntary consent of its sovereign people: security for life and limb, security for property held in peaceful possession without malfeasance, theft, or fraud, the security of the right to self-determination. There are 3 things the safety of which depends on that of the others: the sovereignty of the people, the integrity and fairness of a nation's domestic and foreign policies, and the consistent and unbiased administration of equity. There are 3 things free to everybody upon the earth, the refusal of which no law can justify: food from an abundant field, forest, or orchard; water from a spring, tap, river, or well, for any individual or family in dire need of sustenance; fire from a decayed tree or fence; and peaceful possession of a dwelling or land not in fair use or proven to be rightfully held, following due public notice of a claim by a landless or homeless individual or family or community. There are 3 thieves who should not suffer proceedings against them: any individual compelled under the force of another, any child under 16 years, and anybody who is suffering from any form of generally accepted mental illness, incapacity, or disease. There are 3 rightful applications of equity: prevention of actual suffering, harm, injury, damage, and loss; compensation and/or restitution for all injured parties; and assurance of equitable resolutions, peaceful civil proceedings, and the reconciliation of the accused with their accusers. There are 3 sacred conventions of universal community trust: a convention of families assembled for the purposes of founding a community, a convention of arbitrators assembled for the purposes of administering equity, and a convention of sovereign community trusts assembled for the purposes of establishing independence, accession, and jurisdiction. It is self-evident that freedom cannot coexist with inequality of rights and restrictions, taxation of labor or sweat equity, and the restriction of our freedom to come and go as we please. Any sovereign nation of free indigenous people is necessarily ruined by inordinate privileges for the few, corruption of justice, and a general national apathy towards injustices, which have become prevalent in all so-called modern societies. Long-lasting peace under natural law cannot be established without an end to all wars between nations, the demonopolization of land rights and natural resources, and the repudiation of the laws that were made by mankind to its own detriment and that of the earth. Let it also be known by all that no man can unman a man or uncall a calling. Wherefore, in the indomitable spirit of altruism, united by our similarities as well as our individual uniquenesses, we hereby stand in common unity to affirm the following principles as the foundations of universal community trust. 1. Natural law, also known as the laws of nature, is that which the universal causation of all that is, God, the Supreme Being, the universe, or howsoever described according to subjective preference or faith, has prescribed to all mankind, not by any formal promulgation, but by the internal guidance of reason with heartfelt resonance alone. 2. Natural law forms the permanent and underlying basis of all law, and theories of natural law have been an integral part of jurisprudence throughout the history of man-made laws. 3. We must therefore distinguish between natural law and positive law, which is the body of law created by mankind. 4. Natural law is always superior to positive law. 5. The principles of natural law derive from universal or divine law, otherwise known as the laws of nature. 6. Natural law dictates that man must be allowed to exercise his own free will, but not without bearing the responsibility for his actions. 7. Common law is that which derives its force and authority from the consent and immemorial practice of the people within any community. It has never received the sanction of the legislature by an express act, which is the criterion by which it is to be distinguished from statute law, which is inferior in every respect to common law. 8. In accord with the laws of nature, common law dictates that all men are free to do what they choose for themselves, provided they do not infringe the unalienable rights of another to do the same. 9. Universal Community Trust is hereby established as a supreme jurisdiction in the nations which ratify the terms of this treaty, having united by mutual consent and in common unity, in order to deliberate, determine, and act jointly for the purposes of the restoration of natural law upon the earth, as well as bringing about an end to all wars, genocide, debt slavery, usury, famine, poverty, pollution, and preventable disease. 10. No individual or legal entity is above natural law, and equity, meaning natural justice, is paramount and mandatory under Universal Community Trust, in that no law, statute, or principle can be upheld at the expense of a just, fair, and reasonable outcome. 11. In positive law, a sovereign is one who governs themselves independently of any foreign control, in the union and exercise of all lawful powers possessed and exercised by a sovereign head of state and/or government. In natural law, a sovereign is a man who exercises his unalienable right to self-govern. Under Universal Community Trust, all grantors, trustees, and beneficiaries are therefore considered sovereigns of equal status, each of whom acts in a sovereign capacity at all times. 12. Government is the manner in which sovereignty is exercised in each sovereign state or nation, and democracy is that form of government in which the sovereign power is exercised by the people in a body politic. Democratic government is the body politic which purportedly exercises the sovereign power of the people who elected it, notwithstanding the opposition of a majority of those subjected to its jurisdiction against their will. Self-government and democratic government are therefore mutually exclusive and cannot coexist in any nation. 13. The purported right to enforce democratic, autocratic, or despotic government policy by coercive and/or deceptive methods is always and without exception a breach of natural law, and therefore void ab initio, even when such methods of enforcement are permitted or prescribed under statutes and/or the orders of unlawful and/or de facto courts and/or governments. 14. In the absence of the voluntary and unambiguous consent of the self-governed, representative government or administration cannot rightfully exist. 15. Pursuant to the principles of natural law, man has the unalienable right to self-determination and self-governance, and can therefore at any time choose to revoke his citizenship or deny his consent to be governed by or subjected to any administration or entity or individual, but shall always in any event be responsible for his actions under the guiding principles of natural law. 16. Any man who does revoke or deny his consent to be governed by or as a citizen of any purported authority is free from government control and any perceived statutory obligations, restrictions, and restraints imposed by the state that he was formally or supposedly governed by. 17. Any and all agreements purportedly made for and on behalf of the indigenous peoples of the earth do not in any way bind those who have revoked or denied their consent to be governed by them, nor do any of those agreements preclude the unalienable rights of the indigenous peoples to self-determination and self-governance, as is recognized under the established conventions of international law. 18. Living freely in peace is within any community's equitable standards, and does not create any harm, loss, injury, damage, or liability, or comprise a breach of the peace in any way whatsoever, whereas violence, which only ever begets more violence, has been monopolized by successive, unaccountable and/or purportedly democratic governments, long since dominated by private interests, resulting in persistent, continuing and increasing actions that work to the detriment of mankind and the earth. Declaration of Unalienable Rights. Therefore, in affirmation of our birthrights, and with a view to preventing further crimes against mankind and the earth, it is declared that we are all unalienably endowed with 1. The right to live freely in peace without encumbrances of all natures and descriptions, and to deny or revoke our consent to be governed, regulated, or coerced in any manner whatsoever. 2. The right to hold, use, and enjoy any and all property in our peaceful possession without having to pay for the use or enjoyment of it. 3. The rights to a parcel of permanent land in the region of our birth, including water, mineral, and airspace, to live upon and within for the purposes of making a home, raising children, growing food, and self-realization, which shall be held free and clear in perpetual private trust for the benefit of the next generation. Such rights may be exchanged for similar rights to land in other parts of the earth in accordance with the agreement of the parties. 4. The right to use all necessary and reasonable defences to protect ourselves, our kin and our interests, including the appointment and authorization of defenders of the peace in any community, in the event of any and all circumstances. 5. The right to refuse to supply or to initiate the recall of an intimate or non-intimate DNA sample for any purpose whatsoever. 6. The right to refuse to supply or to initiate the recall of samples of our bodily fluids, skin, hair, bones, organs or tissues in the event of any and all circumstances. 7. The right to refuse to be medicated by any individual, government, corporation, organization or legal entity under any circumstances whatsoever, as well as the right to medicate ourselves as we see fit. 8. The right to cultivate, harvest, store, trade, barter and or use for our own purposes any and all organic substances which will grow or form naturally upon the earth. 9. The right to refuse to be bound by the unlawful judgments, orders, warrants, directives and or rulings of the de facto courts of any entity, party or individual claiming jurisdiction over us. 10. The right to sovereign and Class 1 diplomatic privileges, including, without limitation, the right to use a diplomatic passport or port pass, diplomatic premises, and diplomatic modes of transport, as well as immunity from legal obligations that we have not expressly consented to in any foreign jurisdiction. 11. The right of superior guardianship over our offspring from the date of conception, which shall be presumed to be held jointly with the other biological parent or guardian until proven otherwise under oath or affirmation, without limitation, and strictly precluding civil regulations of any kind under any circumstances whatsoever. 12. The right to hold exclusive powers of attorney over the physical bodies and possessions of our offspring, which shall be considered to be held jointly in private trust with the other biological parent or guardian until proven otherwise, without limitation, and until the 16th anniversary of their physical birth. 13. The right to educate our children at home or in any way we deem to be beneficial for their physical, intellectual, emotional and spiritual development, without limitation, supervision, intervention, inspection or interference of any and all natures and descriptions. 14. The rights of full freedom and intercourse of trade and navigation to and from any port or place on the earth, including, without limitation, the rights to cross international borders and to return to the land of our physical birth at our sole discretion and without interference, taxation, or undue delays of any and all natures and descriptions. 15. The right to make, deposit, and benefit from our own currency or medium of exchange without charges, taxes, or interest, until such time that mankind frees itself from the psychological dependence upon the abstract concept of money as a means of denoting the value and progress of our very existence. 16. The right to expect no detainment, supervision or arrest without a sealed writ issued by a rightful authority alleging breaches of natural law. The right to be presumed innocent of allegations until proven otherwise before a jury of our peers, and the protection of the community wherever we may roam. 17. The rights to life, health, well-being, privacy and silence. 18. The rights to free assembly, expression, thoughts of any and all natures and descriptions, and the right to determine our own spiritual or religious and or non-religious path. In the most simplistic of terms, let all men in all nations under universal community trust be self-governed by the divine maxim, my rights end where yours begin.